Hey everyone, Josh Maul here, and welcome to part 2 of my Blender Cookie tutorial series on creating this cute little stuffed elephant character. In this part, we're going to be covering the creation of some textures, applying the materials, creating the environment, setting up the lighting, and finally rendering out our finished image. So I hope you guys enjoy, and let's get started. Okay, so if you followed along with part 1 of my tutorial series, this is where I left off. If you didn't follow along with part 1, what are you doing here? This is part 2. Go back to part 1. Anyway, so we got our characters all modeled, and now we're going to be setting up the materials, textures, lighting, rendering, environment, basically everything but modeling. So the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to ignore everything that we did in part 1. And no, this is not some sort of cruel joke, but we need to start with a fresh Blender scene. So I'm going to open up a brand new scene here. I'm going to delete any sort of default shape that I may have. Let's collapse this down so I can get a little bit more space. I'm going to turn on my screencast keys. Whew, didn't crash Blender this time. Okay. Alright, so I'm going to delete this light as well because we're not going to be using any lights for this part. Now what we're doing here is we're creating the fabric texture. And the thing that's cool about this technique is, one, it's done 100% in Blender, and two, if you wanted to and had the time, you could adapt this to any sort of cloth texture, whether it be knitted, crocheted, what have you. But in this case, we're just going to do a woven fabric. All right, so I'm immediately going to add in a Bezier curve by hitting Shift A to bring up the add menu and adding in a Bezier curve. I'm going to hit R to rotate it, X to lock it to the X axis, and type in 90 and hit enter, so that if we go into front view mode, let's hit 5 as well to go into orthographic view, we have our curve that is now curving upwards. Alright, I'm going to hit tab to go into edit mode. I'm going to straighten these poles out so that they are straight up and down. Just like that, and I'm going to scale this one down so it's about the same height as the other. If I grab them both, hit S to scale, X along the X axis, I can shrink them in like this, and we want something like this. It's a pretty intense arch. And we're going to need one that's looping down underneath as well, so we'll select this far right one, hit E to extrude, and X to lock it to the X axis, and we'll space it out so where they're about evenly spaced. And we'll need to rotate this one 180 degrees. There we go. Alright, so this is the basis of our fabric texture. We'll go ahead and set this thing up with a little bit of a depth to it. So we'll go to our curve settings here, switch fill to full, and we'll turn the bevel depth up till it's nice and chunky. Something like that. We'll also turn the resolution up to about 4, just to give it a nice smooth curve to it. And that's basically all there is to it. Now to get the rest of the fabric texture created, we're going to be using a bunch of array modifiers. So we're going to start off by going to our modifiers tab, generating an array modifier, and we are going to not use relative offset. And the reason is, if we get all done and we find that the bevel width is too big or too little, we need to adjust it, it will completely throw off the offset on our array if we have it set to relative offset. So we're going to unclick that and turn on constant offset. And now we can adjust the X-axis offset so that these are matched up. Trying to get them close here. Almost got it. Alright. So that looks pretty good. And we'll bump this up to about 7. So now there's 7 instances being arrayed. And we're also going to add, let's minimize that one. We're going to put in another array modifier, turn off relative offset, turn on constant offset, and this time we're going to move it along the z-axis, which I know doesn't look much like the z-axis, that looks like the y-axis, but since we rotated our curve, this is actually the object's z-axis. So that looks pretty good. We'll bump that up to 7 as well. And there we go. There is the backbone of this entire texture. So first thing that we need to do is we need to add in the rest of our weaves. And to do that, we'll select this, hit Shift D, there we go, to duplicate it, right click to leave it right where it's at, and then R to rotate, and we'll just type in 90 and hit enter. and there we've got a perfectly perpendicular piece. Yeah, say that a few times fast. All right, so I'm going to drag this over here so that it kind of matches up, and I want to line up these bumped areas so that the bump that's going up over here is directly above the bump that's going down on this lower piece. And to do that is actually fairly easy. If I drag this over here so you can see, if we go into wireframe mode by hitting Z, you can notice that there's a straight line running straight down the middle of this curve, and also a straight line going straight across the apex of this this arch. And you'll notice the same thing on this one here, straight line here, and a straight line right at that apex. If we take the point where they cross on each of these, and if we line them up on these, so you can see, it doesn't have to be perfect, but you can see that this line and these lines are all lined up right where they cross. And that way we know that this little arch is right above this little opposite arch here. So that's looking good. Now we need to adjust our array modifier so that they line up over here as well, which they at the moment very much do not. So with this one selected, get out of here, Avast. All right, with this selected, we'll go to our second array modifier, and we'll just start adjusting the offset here. Zooming in to give ourselves a little bit more precision. Come on, a little more precision. Ooh, we almost had it. We were almost there. Did you see it? Went right by it. And, oh, there it is. Whew. Okay, so now, oops, let me go back to this view here. You can see that this line is now lined up straight with that straight line at the apex of those curves. And so going this way, it looks perfect. Going the other way, not quite so much. So we'll do basically the same thing. We'll go down here to one of these points. We'll select this one, and we'll start adjusting its offset. And again, zooming in to give ourselves some more. We're almost there, I think. Oh, I'm looking at the wrong point. Let's line it up over here where it belongs. Okay. And, well, that's pretty darn close. I like that. So we're going to call that good right there. Let me take a look at it. Yeah, that looks good. That looks like what we want. All right, now we're going to duplicate each of these one more time. So I'm going to grab this one, turn on the wireframe mode, and Shift D to duplicate. And I'm just going to take these and immediately line them up like this. Make sure I'm lining them up correctly. Yeah, that looks good. Okay, and then I'm going to take this, Shift D, and line it up like this. Okay, and here you can see we have our weave fabric, more or less. And yeah, that's looking good. So to set this up to generate our textures, we're first off going to set our camera to look straight down. So I'm hitting 7 to go into top view mode if you're not already in it. I'll then hit Control, Alt, and 0 on the number pad to snap the camera to that view. So our camera is now looking straight down at our fabric here. But we need to adjust a few things if this is going to tile properly. First off, I'm going to set our resolution here to 512 by 512 and also turn it all the way up to 100%. And I need to adjust the camera lens because right now you can see it's, it gets kind of distorted and warped as it gets towards the edges of the camera lens, which is not what we want. So we're going to go to our camera settings here and switch it to orthographic, which immediately puts it how we want it. And then to adjust the size of it in there, we'll adjust this orthographic scale. And basically what we're looking to do is find a point, like say right here we've got, we're going to put this upper edge right along the middle of this curve here. We want these points where these curves are jutting up to then tile down to a point down here so that when we tile this texture, the bottom point lines up where this top point cuts off. So to do that, we need to adjust our scale until we get to a point, something pretty close to this. All right. So as you can see, if you imagine that that this the inside the camera lens is our texture. Where this cuts off here, it continues seamlessly right down here. And this does not have to be, you know, absolutely perfect, you know, but pretty close. And that looks pretty good. Okay, so that gives us the texture there. So to set this up to work as a texture, we're going to do a few things. First off, we're going to be rendering out two different textures. One of them is going to act as the bump texture. One of them is going to act as kind of a diffuse texture. So for the diffuse texture, I'm going to select one of these, and I want to add a material. So just add a new material. I'm going to turn specularity all the way off, even though there's no light in the scene, so I don't know what would affect the specularity. And then I want to add a material or a texture to that material. So we'll go to the texture panel. I'm going to hit new, and I'm going to add in a wood texture. And on the type of wood texture, I want it to be band noise. And if we select this material tab, we can see that it's adding these, you know, purple curvy wavy lines here, which actually we don't want purple curvy wavy lines. We want kind of a light gray curvy wavy lines. So we'll select our color down here. I'm going to go into the hue saturation value mode, so I can turn the saturation all the way down and turn the value down so it's roughly kind of down here, just a light grayish. Now if I want to let me get rid of those. Okay, if I want to set this up so that it renders out how I want it, I need to adjust the world settings. First thing I want to do is turn the horizon color all the way to black, turn ambient occlusion on, and make sure that this is set to add. And now if I hit F12 to render it out, you kind of get the idea of what's going on. First off, you know, the way a bump texture works is the black part is you know, all the way down, the white part is all the way up, so you can see how this is going to create a fabric looking bump. The wavy lines here are not going to be part of the actual bump, but this is going to help give it a yarn looking texture on the actual the material itself. So that's what that's for. So you kind of get what we're doing here. If we select, let's go ahead and hit Z to go to wireframe, and we'll select all the rest of these and hit Control L and link the materials. Now if we render it out, you can see that looks pretty good. You know, I mean, this is not perfect yarn material, but it looks decent enough, especially at a scale like, you know, this, which is going to be, it's going to be fairly small. So this looks pretty good. The one thing I do want to do before we save any of these things is on our world settings over here, I want to turn our samples up to about 16. And what that's going to do, if I look at the image we just rendered, is it's going to get rid of some of this graininess and noisiness to the ambient occlusion. So I'm going to go ahead and re-render that out. The one thing about turning the samples up is it looks better, but it does take a little bit longer. So we'll let that render here. You can already see it just looks a lot smoother, a lot nicer. Okay, so with this one rendered, this is pretty much all we need for our diffuse. So I'm going to hit F3 to save it, and go ahead and pick where I'm going to save this. And I'm going to just call it Fabric Diffuse, just so I know what it's called. Okay. Now for our bump texture, we don't want any of this yarn detail in there. So we'll go ahead, we'll select one of these, go back to the texture or the material tab, and then over to the textures tab, and just deactivate that texture. So now if we render it out, it will just be the plain white. So let's do that really quick. Okay, now we could just use this as the bump texture, and it would work okay, but the bumpiness on the actual yarn would not be very intense, and I'd like it to be a little bit more intense. So to adjust that, once this is all rendered out, I'm going to hit Control and then the left arrow on my keyboard to bring me to our compositing setup. And down here I'm going to switch this to Render Result, and I'm going to click Use Nodes, and we're just going to be adding in one node, and hitting Shift A to bring up our add menu. We're going to go to Color, RGB Curves, and drop it right down in the middle here. And you can see that by adjusting these curve points, I can kind of boost up that contrast a little bit, and that looks a little bit better. I like that. That'll do. All right, so with that all set up, we'll hit F3 to save this one. We'll call it fabric bump or whatever you want to call it, just so long as you remember what it is. And that's it for this. So we can go ahead and close this one and go back to our elephant scene. Now to apply these textures and get these materials set up, the very first thing I want to do is I want to switch this from the Blender render to Cycles render. And I want to do that now because all of our materials set up, if we set them up in the Blender render and then went to switch it over to Cycles, we'd have a lot of catching up to do. So we'll switch it over to the Cycles render first, and we'll get rid of this light because we're not going to be using it for this. And I'm going to set up a couple of mesh lights in the scene just to be able to see what we're doing once we get the material settings up and going. So I'm going to add in a plane, and before I get too far here, let me turn on my screencast keys. Okay, that way you can see what I'm doing here. Alright, so I'm going to rotate this around. Let me move it over here, something like this. You know, just a real quick and easy mesh light. I'm going to go to the Materials tab, create a new material, and just change it to an emission, and we'll just call this light for right now. And that'll be good. Now, before I get too much farther, I want to go to my world settings. I want to make sure that ambient occlusion is not on. And I'm going to set the background color here to be about a medium gray and a strength of about 0.5. Okay. So now if I switch over to a rendered viewport shading, here we've got just a really quick lighting setup, but it'll be enough to kind of see what's going on with our materials. The one thing that's going to bother me is, let's say I rotate this over here like this, this big white square is in my way. Well, we can fix that fairly easily. If we select this, which it already is, we can go to our Object tab, and then all the way down at the bottom, we have our Ray Visibility tab. And if we switch off this camera, and now we go into the rendered mode, we can see that the light is still here, it's still affecting everything, but it's not actually visible to the camera, which is nice. So that's going to work out just fine. Okay, applying these textures is going to require two things. First off, we have to set up the materials with all the textures. Then we have to UV unwrap our character here. So let's work on the materials first. The one thing I'm going to do is I'm going to split my view at the bottom here, and I'm going to switch it over to a node editor window. I find it easier personally to adjust the material settings using the nodes. And I'm going to turn off these other layers so that all I see is my elephant guy. And I'm going to split this view and change this to a UV image editor. And just X out of that. And if you've never UV unwrapped anything before, essentially what it is if you could imagine peeling an orange and then laying that peel out flat on a table, that's what we're doing with our model here. Is we're taking the geometry and flattening it out onto an image plane, basically, so that we can, then project a texture onto it. All right, so let's get the material set up. So first off, if we see here on his head at the moment includes the headpiece, the ears, the trunk, the eyes. Not really what we want for this particular setting. So going back into edit, or hitting tab to go into edit mode, I'm going to remove some of these objects, or separate some of these objects basically. So I'm going to start with the eye. I'm going to separate the button by, if I hover over it and hit L, it'll select everything linked to that. I'm going to hit P, separate by selection. I'm going to do the same for the, oops, I don't want that part. I'm going to do the same for the stitches here. Select those, P, separate by selection. I'm going to do the same for the trunk. P, separate by selection. And with the ears, I can't actually hover over and hit L because they are in fact linked to the head. So instead, I'm going to select these 4 faces right on the end of his ear, and hitting Control and then plus on the number pad, I can expand that selection until it's just inside that little seam that we created. And I'll hit P, separate by selection, and so now all I have is his head. Alright, now since this has the mirror modifier, and it's basically the actual mesh is only this half of the head here. I'm going to go ahead and just select everything, hit U, and unwrap. And you can see right here that it unwrapped his head. Here's where his ear is, here's his little eye socket, here's where the trunk is. So you kind of get the idea of what's happening. It basically unwrapped it and flattened it along this image here. All right, so now that we've got that first one unwrapped, let's go ahead and tab back out of edit mode and get this material set up. So we'll go over here to the materials tab. We'll create a new material, and we're going to call this one fabric light, because I know we're going to want two different colors of materials, one kind of a light color, one kind of a dark. So we'll call this one fabric light. And we'll jump down here to our node editor window. And I'm going to add in a few extra nodes. I'm going to hit Shift A, going to add in an image texture node. We'll grab and pull this down here. And we'll open up our fabric diffuse. And I'm going to add in a color mix node. And the way this is going to work is I'm going to drag this image texture, the color tab, down to this bottom one here, this color 2, and this color to our diffuse. Now, what this is going to do, if I switch over to not texture mode, material mode. Okay. What this is going to do, the color mix node, is, let's see, first off I want to switch this from mix to multiply. And what this is essentially doing is it's overlaying the dark portions of the texture on top of whatever color we pick, which, since we're going to want kind of a light blue color, something like this, you can see kind of what it's doing is, it has that blue color, but it's overlaying the texture on top of it, which is, it gives it kind of a nice effect. And this factor here is going to determine how much of that it affects it. So if we switch this all the way down to a factor of 0, it's only this color. There is none of the texture being mixed. If we switch it all the way up to 1, then since we're set on multiply, the black parts of the texture are solid black, and everything else is kind of overlaid at the intensity of the black that's there. I hope that made some sort of sense. Anyway, I found personally that I like a factor of about 0.9, because then these squares aren't solid black, and I kind of like that personally. Alright, so we've got that on there. To set up the bump, we're going to do some very similar things. We're going to add in an image texture node down here. Then we'll open up our fabric bump texture, and we could just drag this color point all the way to the displacement, which would in fact give us the bump, but would give us 0 control over the bump. So the way that I like to do it is I'm going to add in a converter math node, and I'm going to switch this to multiply. I'm going to drag the color to one of these values, and then the value to the displacement. And now this value right here becomes the intensity of our bump. So if we set this to 0, there would be no bump. If we set this to 100, it would look really stupid. If we set it to like 0.5, it would be halfway between what the bump would normally have been, if that makes any sense. It's basically taking this value of the image texture and multiplying it by this value and then going to the displacement. So right now, it would be half of the bump than if we just took this and drag it straight to the displacement. So let's get this set up a little better so we can then better visualize what's happening. First off, I'm going to go hit tab to go into edit mode. And over here in our UV image editor, if we take all these UVs, make sure they're all selected, and hit S and start scaling them, you can see that it immediately affects the size of the texture over here. And so at this point, you can kind of just get it set up, how you think it'll look good. I think that'll look fine. Yeah, something like that'll work fine. So if we hit tab to leave edit mode, we can now switch over to, let's turn on both our layers, so we have our light here, and switch over to a rendered view. And already, this is looking pretty fabric-y, which, is totally a word. I do want to make a few adjustments. First off, the bump I think is a little bit strong. I'm going to bring it maybe down, maybe all the way to 0.1. So it's a real subtle bump. I like that. I like that better. And the color is a little bit dark for me, so I'm going to turn the value all the way up, maybe make it a little bit more bluey. Okay, that looks good. Alright, so that looks really good so far. Yeah, I like that. For the rest of him, let's see, let me go back here like this. Alright, so for the rest, it's essentially the same process, you know, UV unwrapping and applying the materials. But let's go ahead and make our second material, which is going to be the dark fabric. So first off, we'll select something that's going to be that material, such as the ears. We'll select this to bring a list of materials that we already have, and we'll select fabric light. And it's got this little number 2 next to it, and that is basically an indicator of how many objects in the scene are using this material, which right now we have 2. We have the head and now the ears. Well, since this is going to be a separate material, but you know, it's basically the exact same settings except for the color, we'll start with this and then we'll click on that little 2, which will then create a unique texture or a unique material out of that existing one. And we can name this fabric dark. And the only thing that we're going to change is this color right here. And we're just going to make this kind of a darker blue. Which then now, turn this back on, jump into our rendered settings, we can see it's about the right color, but you know, the texture's not really there. Well, that's because we need to UV unwrap his ears. So tabbing to go into edit mode, I'm going to select, if I hit Alt and right click on these edge loops here, just like that, Control E and mark seam, it'll mark those at as a splitting point for the UV. I'm going to select all, hit U and unwrap, and now if we jump into a textured view, we can see the textures there. Scale these up, and there we go. And we want to do, you know, we want to do a good job of trying to match the scale of the textures so that, you know, his head isn't massive weaves and his ear, you know, less massive. And you know, you can rotate these so that it looks like they fit a little bit better. I like that. We'll call that good. So we'll do the same with his trunk. With his trunk though, just to give you an example really quick, we go in here, hit Shift A, U, unwrap, and we'll assign it the fabric dark texture. Well, on here, if I start scaling his nose or his trunk, you can see this front part is a little bit goofy looking, and that's because with the mirror modifier, the texture is mirrored exactly from one side to the other, which it works okay on the head because it's got this split. It works okay on the ears because they're not connected, but for something like this, it's not gonna fly. So let's hit Tab to leave edit mode, go over to the modifier stack, and we're just going to apply the mirror modifier. So now we can go in here and we can actually unwrap this thing correctly. And the way I'm going to do it is I'm going to select this entire edge loop here by Alt right clicking it. I'm going to hit Z to toggle wireframe and C to bring up my brush select tool. And then by using the middle mouse or clicking the mouse wheel, I can then just deselect objects or edges, just like that. Hit Control E to mark the seam, select everything, hit U and select unwrap. And now if we go to a textured view, we can see as I scale this up that looks much, much better. Alright, so that looks pretty good. With his body, I want to separate the arms and legs, much like we did the trunk and the ears from the head. So we'll go in here, we'll select the arm, which my arm is actually already selected, but if it's not, I'm going to select it the same way I would the ears, selecting these two end faces and hitting Control and then plus until it is right inside that little seam there, hitting P and separating by selection, and doing the exact same thing to the leg, just like that, P, separate by selection. Okay, and now with his body, I'm going to switch back to edge select mode, and I'm going to select this series of edge loops running directly up his side, remembering also to get, you know, on both sides of the arms and legs. So as you can see, just like that. With those selected, hitting Control E to mark seam, selecting all, hitting U to unwrap, and over in our materials tab, we want to set this with fabric light because it's also going to be using the light fabric, same as the head. And we'll switch back over to a textured view and start scaling these till I about match the scale, something like that. Okay. And then we'll really quickly do his arms and legs, which I'm going to do his arm pretty much the same as we did his trunk, with the exception, with the exception of the fact that I'm also going to unwrap this entire little front part. Okay, so with those selected, we'll hit Control E to mark seam, unwrap, right here to the texture. Oh, we need to assign the material. We'll assign fabric dark, scale this until it's about the same. Okay, and going in here, doing just like the trunk, we're not going to select this bottom part. Oops. But I am going to deselect all of these. Control E, mark seam, unwrap it, assign the fabric dark, and scale it up just like that. Okay. So now if we switch back over to both our layers here and switch to the rendered, you can see that's looking pretty good already. Yeah, I like that. I do want to tweak some of the colors a little bit. This fabric dark, I want to turn the saturation down. I don't want it to be quite that saturated. Come on. Stop it. Just do what I want. There we go. Something like that looks pretty good. I like that. All right. Alright, so that is pretty much that. I'm going to go ahead and shrink down these views because I'm not going to need them quite so much at the moment. And let's really quickly finish off our elephant here. We'll grab the little button here. I'm going to turn the rendered mode, the rendered shading back on so we can see what's happening. I'm going to create a, get out of here, Twitter. I'm going to create a new material and just call it button. And okay, this one is just going to be a simple mix shader. So I'm going to just go down here, select mix shader. The first shader is going to be a diffuse shader. And the second shader is going to be a glossy shader. And I'm going to turn off the render there because it's going amazingly slow. But basically, the diffuse is going to be set to pretty much just a black. Not solid black, but pretty close. The glossy, I want to set the roughness, which is basically how shiny it is. I want to set that to 0.1, which is the smaller the number, the more shiny. And I want to set the factor, which is the amount that these two are mixed, to a 0.1, which means it's 90% of this diffuse texture, 10% this glossy texture. So now if I switch back over to the rendered, you can see this gives us a perfect little shiny plastic button. That looks pretty good. Okay. Alright, so now we just have the peanuts and the bag. So for this is fairly simple. First off, the bag's kind of clunky looking because of the displacement modifier. So let's fix that really quick before we get too far. And I'm just going to add in another subdivision surface modifier underneath the displacement and just set the subdivisions to 1. That way it just kind of rounds out some of those weird pointy jagged edges. Okay, so in the materials, I'm going to select new. We'll just call this bag. And both the bag and the peanuts are just going to have a simple diffuse. And this one we're just going to kind of pick up a light brownish color. Turn on our rendered. That looks pretty good. For the peanuts, we're going to select one, select new material. Call it peanut. Get out of here, Twitter. And again, just a standard diffuse material. And this one, just want kind of a peanut looking color. And that actually looks pretty good. I like that. Okay, so we'll hit, we'll get out of that view mode there. But Z to go into wireframe. And I want to select all of these peanuts quickly. And so the way I'm going to do that is hit B to bring up my box select. Select all these peanuts. B to bring up the box select again, and then using the middle mouse button, clicking and dragging over all of this stuff to deselect it. So now I have all the peanuts selected with the one peanut that has the material as the active selection, which is exactly what I want. And with it like that, I can hit Control L, go down to materials, and that will apply the materials of this active selection to the rest of the selection. So now if we switch back over to a rendered view, you can see that they all have the peanut texture on them. Okay, and that is pretty much it for the textures and materials. Really quickly, I'm going to set up just a real simple mouse texture. He's just going to be a diffuse, kind of a grayish, something like that. Okay, and that is it for the materials and the textures. So that's looking pretty good. All right. Let's move on to the little fuzzy bits that are going to be all over this guy. Because anything made of yarn has little flyaway bits of thread popping out all over it. And so we're going to add some of those in. Now, since we're using Cycles, we can't actually use particle hair because Cycles does not render hair particles. But we can use the particle system to set up, basically create our own little particle hairs that it will then it will put all over it. So to do that, I'm going to jump into a new layer, hit Shift A to add in a Bezier curve, Tab to go into edit mode, and with everything selected, I want to hit 7 to go into top view mode, and I want to grab and move one of these points down towards this origin point. And that'll probably work out fine. And that's really all I want to do with it for right this second. Back in our curve settings here, switch this over from half to full, turn up the bevel depth a bit, not a huge amount, something like that will be fine. Go back into edit mode, select just the point that's not at the origin point, and hit Alt and S, and scale it in like that, and then we have ourselves a little hair thing. And just to make this easier when we get to the next phase here, I'm going to go over to with it still selected, go to the Object tab, scroll all the way up, and just name this Fuzz. As for the material for this, it's really simple. I'm going to set up a new material, we'll call it Fuzz, and it's also going to be a mix shader. Shader 1 will be translucent, shader 2 will be transparent. We're going to leave the factor at 0.5, we're going to leave both colors at white. It's done. So with that, we can go back to our elephant here. And for this part, I found it easier, once we get all the materials and everything set up, to rejoin all of these pieces back into a single mesh. And so to do that, I'm going to select each piece, like so. Well, actually, first off, before I do that, I want to go to each piece and I want to apply the mirror modifier, which I do because I found that adding a particle system to something that has a mirror modifier on it gives me some weird results, and I haven't actually resolved why yet. So until then, I'm just going to do it this way. So all the mirror modifiers applied, I select all the pieces, and I'm going to hit Control J to join. So now the elephant is now all one piece. So with that all done, we can go over to our particle settings, make sure the elephant is selected, go to the particle settings, and we'll create a new particle system. And we want to switch this from emitter to hair. And all of a sudden, that looks pretty awful and weird. So right now it's rendering a path, which is basically this. But Cycles doesn't render paths. So we need to select this to Object. And on our Object window down here, scroll down until we find our Fuzz object. And there we have it, looking fairly awful. So to get it to look a little bit better, first thing I want to do is turn on the advanced options up here. I want to turn on the random distribution here, and let's see, down under rotation, we'll turn that on and we'll expand out this menu here. I'm going to turn the type from velocity hair to normal and turn both of these random faders all the way up. Now it still looks pretty goofy, so I'm going to adjust the size down here in the physics tab until I get about something like this, and then put the random about halfway up. If I put it up too far, some of the fuzz just gets too small, but this gives it a nice random variation. Now this is the part that gets a little tricky because we need about 1 billion more of these things. But if we go up here and turn the number up to a huge amount, it's going to really slow things down. So before I do that, I'm going to jump over to the modifiers tab, and you can see that the particle settings have added their own modifier to the stack. Well, if we turn off this little eyeball, it will prevent it from being shown in the viewport. However, it will still be rendered. So this way we can adjust it to as high a particles as we want, and it will not affect the viewport. It will, however, affect the renders, so I don't suggest going crazy. But I've done some few experiments on this, and I found personally that about 50,000, which sounds like a lot because it is, but I found that that gives a pretty good effect. Okay, and that pretty much takes care of the fuzz. Now, the only part we have left is the environment and the lighting, but before we get too far, I want to talk a little bit about composition. Now, I learned about this thing called the rule of thirds, and it was taught to me again by that particular Australian gentleman, and it's basically a magical way of making your renders look more interesting, or so I've come to understand it. Basically, it goes like this. If we hit 0 to jump into our camera view mode, and we select our camera by just right-clicking on the little border here, we can go to our camera settings, and down here under display, there's this composition guide, and we can click on this one called thirds. And this is basically what the rule of thirds states, is that if you were to subdivide your viewport here into a 3x3 grid, and then if you were to line up the elements in your scene, you know, the important elements in your scene with these grid lines, that it makes the image more aesthetically appealing. I don't know why that is, but apparently that's what people say. And I personally have to agree. You know, I like it being a little more offset. You know, for some reason, maybe it's just how human beings are, I kind of like it. If you don't like it, you know, you don't have to do it. That's fine. But with that in mind, let's start looking at some composition related things. So for me personally, I like to keep my environment and my camera facing straight on these axes points. So for example, I like to have my camera facing straight front on. So I'm going to hit 1 to go into front view mode, and Control-Alt-0 to snap my camera to that front view. And so now you can see, here's my camera right where I want it. And as far as the composition of the characters goes, this is not really going to do. You know, I kind of know what I want, and that's not it. So I'm going to select both of the characters, and I'm going to hit R to rotate and Z to rotate along the Z axis until I get them, you know, kind of about how I want them. Oops, I don't want to move them around, but yeah, something like that. So with them in place, I'm going to adjust my camera here. If I grab the camera with G and then click the middle mouse or the mouse wheel, I can push and pull the camera. I'm going to push it in quite a bit, and I'm going to drag it down along the Z axis and rotate it along the X axis, just like so. Okay, yeah, I like that. And maybe move it along the X axis a little bit, something like that, so that these are kind of lined up with these lines here. That's pretty good. I like that. Alright, as far as the environment goes, first off, I always advocate putting characters in some kind of an environment. It doesn't even have to be a good environment, just some kind of an environment. But we're going to be doing a pretty simple little environment here, just a basic floor and a basic wall. That's all we're going to do. But we're not just going to use a couple planes. We're going to give it a little more character than that. So for the floor, I'm going to build a little tile floor. So to do that, I'm going to hit Shift A to add in a plane. Just drag it over here so it's out of the way. Tab to go into edit mode, and I'm going to select vertex mode. I'm going to hit S to scale it down just a little bit. E to extrude, and then right click to just drop that extrusion where it's at, and then S to scale it out a little bit. And I'm going to hit G and Z to grab it along the Z axis just a little bit. And that's our tile. Alright, so if we take this, let's go ahead and get rid of this plain floor. You're not going to need it. Okay, so here's our tile. So in order to make the floor, I'm going to just add in a couple array modifiers. You know, bring it up a bunch. We'll add in a second array modifier. Oops, let's adjust the proper array modifier. Here we go. And we'll put this down, put this at 1, not Z. There we go. Okay, so now you can see we have kind of a little floor here. We'll adjust it a little bit here. So it just looks a little, we don't want our mouse to be standing right on one of those cracks. Grab this so it looks something more like this. Okay, that looks pretty good. I'm okay with that. And for our wall, let's give it kind of like a wooden plank feeling to it. So we'll add in another plane. We're going to rotate this along the x-axis by 90 degrees. And we're going to do something very similar. Tab to go into edit mode, scale it down a little bit. E to extrude, right click, S to scale it up. We're going to grab these and move them along the y-axis a bit. And then we're going to, from front view mode here, grab this whole bottom half and pull it down along the z-axis, something like that. So if we, okay, and we'll add in a couple of modifiers, or actually just one array modifier here. It'll look something like this, okay. And we'll grab and we'll push this back along the back edge here and put up along the z-axis. That looks pretty good. Okay, so that's pretty much it for our environment. We'll set up a couple quick materials, and when setting up, you know, when deciding on colors, for instance, since I have a blue elephant, it would probably be wise of me not to have a blue background. In fact, if I go over here, I'm going to add a new material to these tiles, call it tile, and I'm going to set this as a mix shader. We'll go diffuse, stop it, glossy. We'll set the glossy to 0.2 is probably good. The factor about 0.2, and we'll set the diffuse. Since our elephant is in this side of the color spectrum, we should probably pick a color from this side. So let's pick kind of like a mellow orange color. Not really a brown, we want a little more saturation than that. Okay, something like that. We switch over to our rendered view. Yeah, I like the way that looks. You know, that looks pretty good. For our wall, select a new one. We'll just call it wall. We're just going to leave it a plain diffuse. And this one we want to, again, select from this side of the spectrum. But this one I want to be more of a brown color. Something like that. You know, just make it look kind of like wooden planks almost. Okay, you know, that looks good. Okay, so our environment's in place, our characters are ready, the fuzz is ready, everything's set to go. Let's get this lighting set up. Now, this would be okay. It's not great, but it's all right. But you know, let's look at a few more things we can do with the lighting. All right, for one thing I like to do in scenes like this particularly is turn the environment lighting all the way off. And what this does is, if we go back to the rendered mode, the only light in the scene are coming from our actual lights. And I like this for a few reasons. One, because it allows me to really plant the focus where I want it, and it also allows me to have 100% control over all of the lighting in the scene. So with that in mind, let's add in a couple more lights here. So I'm going to add in another mesh light by adding in another plane, bringing it something like this, scaling it up a little bit bigger, and we'll add in a new material for this one. It'll be an emission, and I'm going to take this first light that we created, and I'm going to turn its strength up to about 1.5 and give it a little bit, just a slight yellowish tint. And then this new light that we just created, going to leave its emission, we'll take it down to about a 0.8. I'm going to give it a slight blue tint. So now if we jump in here, go to rendered settings. Oh, first off, let's select this this light here, turn off its camera ray visibility. Okay. And then it gives us a nice light coming in from over here, and then that blue kind of rim light coming in from over here. And I like that. I think that looks pretty good. The one thing, the background is a little bit dull. And a technique that I've kind of found that I like is to add in another mesh light like this, scale it along the x-axis. Let me just scale it up in general. And we'll just we'll give it a new emission material, and we'll adjust this one as we need to. But let's go ahead and switch this over to a rendered view, and you can see that it just kind of casts that light down. I'm gonna scale it along the x-axis in a little bit to kind of create a little bit of that vignette look to it. Yeah, I like how that looks. But I am going to give it a little bit of an orangish tone and also bump the strength down to a 0.5 because I don't want it to be so bright that the elephant no longer stands out. I want the elephant to be the primary source of focus in this. And that looks good. I really like how this looks. Okay, so the only other thing we're going to do is set up a little bit of a depth of field. I just particularly like a little depth of field. So to get this set up, we'll jump into a side view mode here. And with our camera selected and in our camera options over here, we're going to turn on the limits button here. And that way when we start adjusting the depth on our depth of field here, we can see this little yellow crosshair is going to be our focus point. So I want to move that so it's right about in the elephant's face. And as far as the size, I want to start with a 0.07 and see how I like that. So we'll do a quick test render of this to see how we like things. I'm going to set this down to about 50%, set the samples down. Okay, 10% is fine for right now. And just do a really quick test render to kind of get a very basic idea of how everything's going to look. Okay, so we got the nice depth of field there. We got the nice background here. You can see the fuzz on the guy, tiles looking nice. Okay, I think this is gonna work. I think this is gonna work out okay. So once we've got the test render all figured out, and we got a pretty good idea that this is gonna look all right, I think the one thing I am gonna do is on our elephant here, go to my particle settings. I'm gonna turn the size of this down just a little bit. Okay, let's try that. The fuzz just looked a little bit, a little intense. That looks a lot better. Okay, because we don't want the fuzz, he's not an actual animal, he's a stuffed animal. Okay, I think that's going to look fantastic. All right, so we've got the lighting in place. We've got all the elements ready to go. Now it's time to render out the final image. Now, cycles, if you're not real familiar with it, basically, it is not the same as the Blender internal render engine. I'm sure that you've had a chance to play with it as it's been around for quite a while. But if you haven't, I'll give you a quick little rundown here. First off, let's turn our resolution up to 100% to get a full-size image. And this is what we want to mess with right here are these samples. Now, right now I was rendering at 10 samples, which looks like this. As you can see, extremely noisy, grainy, not appealing whatsoever. And that's because the samples were at such a low number. Now, the more samples, the clearer and crisper the image looks, but the longer it takes to render. So it's kind of a mixed bag. If you set this all the way up to 1,000, it would look fantastic when it was done, but it might take you quite a while depending on your computer. So for this case, I'm going to set it to about 150. That way it's low enough to where it's not going to take forever, but high enough to where it's probably going to look pretty good. So with that all in place, we are basically finished. So I'm going to go ahead and render out a final full res version, and I will be back with you guys when it is done. Alright, so here we have the finished image. I hope you guys enjoyed this tutorial series, and more importantly, I hope you guys learned something that maybe you didn't know about Blender. I'd like to thank the guys over at Blender Cookie for giving me the chance to do this. And yeah, that's it for me. So I hope you guys enjoyed. I can't wait to see some of your results, and hopefully I will see you in the future.